In this lesson, we're going to go through some of the evidence that has been gathered by scientists over many, many years that is in favor of evolution. So, evidence that supports the theory of evolution comes from a variety of scientific fields. So, it comes from paleontology, right, the study of fossils, from selective breeding, biogeography, embryology, molecular biology, and comparative anatomy. So we're going to look at each of those fields and look at some of the evidence that they have that supports evolution. So we'll start with paleontology. It's a big one. So the fossil record. So strong evidence for a changing Earth began with careful examination of fossils. And a fossil is any preserved remains or traces of an organism or its activity. The most common and easily recognized fossils are of hard body parts, such as shells, bones, and teeth, but fossils can also include impressions of burrows, or footprints, or even chemical remains. So, sedimentary rocks containing fossils reveal a fossil record of the history of life on Earth and show the kind of organisms that were alive in the past. Less than 1% of the species that have been found in the fossil record are alive today. And the layers of sedimentary rock correspond to time periods, right? With the oldest rock is deepest, right? Because things build up on top. So as the diagram shows, the rock down further down is older than the rock on the surface. So, a scientist by the name of Cuvier is thought to have developed the science of paleontology, and he made some very important observations. So, when he studied the fossils in a selection of sedimentary rock, he found that fossils of simple organisms were found at all depths. Fossils of more complex organisms were found in the shallower deposits. And the fossils in the shallower deposits were more likely to resemble living species. So that is evidence that organisms have changed, right? They've become more complex because in the deeper parts of the rock, there's really only simple organisms. And then the organisms become more complex the closer you get to the surface, and then they start to more resemble species that are currently alive. The other thing that the fossil record has given us is the discovery of transitional fossils. And this was further support to the idea that organisms can slowly adapt and change. So, what a transitional fossil is a fossil that shows intermediary links between groups of organisms and shares characteristics common to both groups. So, we'll look at a couple important examples. So, the first one is Archaeopteryx. And so this organism lived about 150 million years ago, and it has characteristics of both birds, because it has feathers and wings, and also characteristics of reptiles, teeth, claws on its wings, and a bony tail. So it is support for the hypothesis that birds evolved from dinosaurs because it has characteristics of both of those groups in a single organism. Another example is Acanthostega, and I have no idea if that's how you actually pronounce it, but it lived about 360 million years ago, and it shows the link between fish and amphibians because it has both gills and lungs, limbs and toes, and a long fish-like tail, and a jaw filled with teeth. It's got a little bit of both types of organisms. So this shows that the land vertebrates may have evolved from fish via an aquatic animal that had legs. So because these transitional fossils show characteristics of two groups, they're showing that transition from one type of organism to another. So, the existence of transitional fossils supports the theory that large evolutionary changes in species are the result of many small and ongoing changes and processes. And this model is called gradualism. So, it's one of the models of the pace of evolution. And transitional fossils support this model. So, this is that the large changes, so in the diagram, the large changes, which is the two different butterflies at the end from a single common ancestor, went step by step by step till they eventually became quite different. There is another theory, however, because the problem is that many very distinct species appear suddenly in the fossil record, and there's little evidence of a gradual transition from one species to another. And their sudden appearance is often followed by little change over long periods of time. So one species, it stays the same for a long, long time, and then just all of a sudden it changes. So one explanation for this is that the fossil record is incomplete. We just haven't found those transitional forms. Another explanation is an alternative model of evolution called punctuated equilibrium. And so this model states that large evolutionary changes are a result of relatively rapid spurts of change, followed by long periods of little or no change. So, generally, it is now widely accepted that both these things are at work. Sometimes the changes are gradual, other times they are quick, and the change happens rapidly. So that is the evidence from paleontology and the fossils. So now we'll move into selective breeding. So the breeds of animals that are reared for human use were developed from wild species by selecting individuals with desirable traits and breeding from them. So this is true for animals and also for plants. And so this is called artificial selection. So humans, rather than the environment, are exerting the selective pressure. Right? The humans are choosing which characteristics they want to promote and which organisms they want to breed. And we know that artificial selection can produce dramatic change, thus demonstrating experimentally that species are not fixed and are able to evolve. So this slide just shows a couple examples. So one is the selective breeding of dogs, right? We know that there's a huge variety of dogs. So through selective breeding processes, humans have been able to change the characteristics of these animals. Another example from plants is that there's a bunch of different vegetables that all come initially from a wild mustard plant, and they were bred for different characteristics to get different things like cauliflower and cabbage, kohlrabi, broccoli, kale. So just by breeding them selectively for different things. Okay, so that was the evidence from selective breeding. So now moving on to biogeography. So, biogeography is the careful observation and analysis of the geographical distribution of organisms. So, it's basically studying where organisms are found. So, what has been observed is that geographically close environments are more likely to be populated by related species than are locations that are geographically separate but environmentally similar. So, one example is with cactuses. So, cactuses are found all throughout the deserts in the Americas and South Central America, but they're actually not found in deserts anywhere else in the world. So, that would suggest that the cactus sort of evolved in that location, but not in the other location, even though the environment is similar. And it's also been found that fossils in certain regions closely resemble the species that are currently living in that region. And the fossils are representing the ancestral forms of those living organisms. So we're going to look at the example of Madagascar, the island of Madagascar. So Madagascar is thought to have permanently split from the African continent about 50 million years ago. Before that, it was part of the continent. So species that are present on the island must have remained on it when it broke away, or they must have somehow got from the mainland, so by swimming, floating, or flying to from the mainland to the island. So an example in Madagascar comes from the lemurs. Right? So if you've seen the Madagascar movies, you probably know about the lemurs. So Madagascar is actually the only place in the world where lemurs are found naturally. However, the fossil record shows that lemurs were once widespread throughout all of Africa, but now only in Madagascar. So why are the lemurs no longer present in Africa? When Madagascar permanently split from Africa 50 million years ago, there were no monkeys yet. So the lemurs were in both locations during the split. The lemurs went to Madagascar, the lemurs stayed in Africa. Then monkeys evolved, and they had no way of getting to Madagascar. So now there's monkeys and lemurs in Africa, but only lemurs on Madagascar. So what happened is the monkeys outcompeted the lemurs, right? They took over the niche that occupied by the lemurs and drove lemurs to extinction on mainland Africa. But because there were no monkeys in Madagascar, the lemurs were able to thrive. Okay, moving on to embryology, which is the study of embryos. And so the study of embryos has also been used to determine evolutionary relationships among organisms. So when you look at embryonic development in different organisms, they have similar stages. And this points to a common ancestral origin for all of those organisms. So as an example, in the early stages of development, fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals all have a tail and gill pouches. They don't all keep those until they're fully developed, but they have them at the beginning, suggesting that their common ancestor had those traits. So this I find to be a really interesting diagram. So what it shows you is the development of the embryo of a bunch of different organisms. And if you look at the top row, where we go from fish, and then we have chicken, pig, rabbit, human, they don't look all that different, right? So in our very first stages, we look a lot like a fish. But we know that ultimately we are very different from a fish, right? So as development continues, we change. But what this suggests is that we all come from a common ancestor with those initial traits. And then we've evolved separately to fill whatever environmental niche we needed to fill. So then the next evidence for evolution comes from molecular biology. And so this is molecular biology is the study of DNA and proteins and things in cells. So we can see evolutionary relationships among species in their DNA. If two species have similar patterns in their DNA, this similarity indicates that these sequences must have been inherited from a common ancestor. And the degree to which DNA sequences are similar between species determines how closely related those species are, or how much time has passed since they split off from that common ancestor. Because at the point of the common ancestor, their DNA was the same. And so if their DNA hasn't changed that much, then they're closely related because they haven't been split from the common ancestor for very long. And so, an example, humans and chimpanzees share about 97.5% of their DNA sequences. Okay, so very similar. But it's amazing what that 2.5% has changed, right? Because really, humans and chimpanzees have a lot of major differences. Okay, last place where we get some evidence of evolution is comparative anatomy. So this is just comparing structures in different organisms. So if you look at this diagram, so this is showing a human arm and a cat leg and paw, a whale fin, and a bat wing. So when you actually look at the structure, they all are made up of the same bones. The sizes have changed a little bit, but you can identify all of the same bones in those four structures. But those four structures all do different things, right? So the human arm doesn't do the same things as a cat's leg or a whale's fin or the bat wing, right? They all do different, carry out different functions. So these structures are formed in similar ways during embryonic development and they share similar arrangements. However, they have somewhat different forms and they have different functions. And they are what is called homologous structures. These structures are similar because they were inherited from a common ancestor and then they evolved based on the organism's lifestyle and environment. So, in a previous lesson, we talked about divergent evolution. So, this is what happens from divergent evolution. We end up getting homologous structures. So, now let's look at another comparison. Okay, so we compare different wings. So, if you look at these different wings, they all allow the organism to fly, but they are structured very differently, right? A bird's wing is nothing like a butterfly wing, which is completely different from a bat wing, right? They all have their own structure, but they all allow the organism to fly. So, these structures don't have a common evolutionary origin, but they perform similar functions. They're called analogous structures. And they have similar functions because they were subjected to similar environmental pressures. So, with this example, all of those organisms were better able to survive in their environment if they could fly. So, any changes that allowed them to fly were selected for, but they started at a different place. So, they created analogous structures. And analogous structures are a result of convergent evolution. So, no common ancestor, but similar environmental pressures. And then the last thing from comparative anatomy. So, here are some things from humans, right? So, the tailbone, the appendix, goosebumps, wisdom teeth, and they all have something in common, and that is that we don't really need them. They don't really serve a very much of a function in humans. So these structures are a reduced version of a structure that was functional in the organism's ancestors, and they're called vestigial structures. So if we think about goosebumps, right? When you get cold or when you're like scared a little bit, you get these goosebumps, and it's like, what is that accomplishing? But in the ancestor, if there was more fur, more hair, it like puffed them up, right? It made them look scarier. It kept heat in better, right? So it used to have a function, but it doesn't really anymore. So it's a vestigial structure. So how did they kind of they're on the way out is one way to say it. So how did that happen? So if the function of the structure is no longer beneficial for survival, the likelihood that future offspring will inherit the normal form of it decreases. In some cases, the structure actually becomes detrimental to the organism, or at a minimum, it's going to require extra energy to produce. So there's some selective pressure for the removal. Right? It's not going to be huge, but over time, these structures and features are reduced because there's no selective pressure acting on them, and they may even be a slight detriment to the organism because they take energy to produce. So there you have all of the, well, not all of the evidence of evolution, but a selection of the fields that have provided evidence and some of the key evidence that uh, is in favor of the theory of evolution.